When he laughed off my plea, I never would have guessed that in just a few hours, he'd be begging for my mercy. And I'd have the power to make it happen. My day started like any other, but I knew something was off even before I left the house. The routine I'd tried so hard to build, work, studies, trying not to dwell on the past, felt heavier that day. It wasn't just the Monday blues, it was the constant feeling of being overshadowed by him, my adoptive brother, who never had an issue reminding me I was nothing compared to what he'd achieved. I worked at a small digital marketing agency, trying to pay my bills and dream of something bigger. Meanwhile, he was running a billion-dollar company, dazzling at events, getting all the applause and respect. I knew our worlds were miles apart, but I always hoped he could at least be human. Turns out, he couldn't. When I decided to ask for a favor, I thought it'd be a simple thing, something siblings do without drama. All I wanted was a contact, an introduction to an important client. For him, it was routine. For me, it could be the breakthrough I needed. My hand trembled a bit holding the phone before I called, but I took a deep breath and talked myself out of giving up. It was just a request. There was no reason for him to treat it like a joke. When he answered, his cold, dry voice hit me like a punch to the gut. "You seriously think I'm going to waste my time with that?" He sneered, a mocking laugh in the background. "You'll never amount to anything if you keep begging for favors like this." That cutting tone, that outright contempt felt like a blade twisting deep inside me. I tried to explain, tried to just ask for a chance, but he wasn't interested. And what hurt most? That humiliation wasn't just in his voice. I knew if we were face to face, his eyes would gleam with satisfaction, seeing me flustered. I hung up, my chest tight, the weight of his rejection crushing every ounce of hope I had. In that instant, something shifted inside me. I knew I couldn't keep living like that, underrated, dismissed as if I had no worth. That no wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the most important decision I'd ever make. I promised myself that from that day forward, I wouldn't let anyone else define my worth. Not him, not anyone. And it was right then, phone still in hand, that a bold idea started to form in my mind. It wouldn't be easy. I might even stumble along the way. But I was going to prove, first to him, then to myself, that I could turn the tables. And so, it all began. Sometimes, it's tough to separate what happened in the past from how it shaped who I am today. My adoptive brother Jason was never just some distant relative. He was always the shadow that eclipsed any flicker of light I might have. As far back as I can remember, he dominated everything around him, and I was just someone he liked to put down, to step on to feel bigger. As a kid, I tried to fit in, to do what I could to not be a burden on the family, but Jason already showed clear signs he wanted to control every little bit of what happened. At family gatherings, he'd mock my clothes, the way I talked, how I acted. It wasn't just a kid playing around. It was a clear strategy to put me down. I remember his 10th birthday party when he declared in front of everyone that I would never have anything to offer, and that I'd always be behind him. The laughter that followed still echoes in my head. During adolescence, things only got worse. More than once, I tried to talk to him, to ask for respect, to say I deserved more than his harsh words, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Jason loved being the center of attention, the favorite, the owner of our story. He made sure to remind me of my weaknesses, to put me in situations where I felt small. And worse, the family hardly ever stepped in. They saw it as playful teasing, or just didn't want to get involved. For years, I carried that suffocating feeling of not being good enough. It was a tough cycle to break. The more he humiliated me, the more I doubted myself. And the truth is, I hesitated to confront him because the fear of losing the little I had was too great. I didn't want more fights, didn't want to be rejected. I wanted a bit of peace, even if it was painful. But that hesitation came at a steep price. My self-esteem was chipped away. I constantly wondered if I really had any worth, if I'd ever be able to break free from the role Jason insisted on giving me, the role of the failed, useless sister. I wanted to prove to myself he was wrong, but doubt always held me back. Now, as I look back at that phone call, I realize that behind the pain and humiliation, something new began to stir. I'm not going to let those past memories define me anymore. Jason might have dominated my childhood, but he won't control my future. And for the first time, I feel like I can face what I've always feared. The truth is, I'm not that scared little girl anymore. I'm ready to show him and everyone that I can be more, that I deserve more, and above all, that I won't hide in his shadow any longer. But it wouldn't be easy. Jason had more than just money and power. He had years of control and manipulation, and I'd have to be ready for whatever came next. What I didn't know then was that the biggest battle was just beginning, and that the decision to fight would change everything. My brother's company was almost a living, breathing entity. Something. That, to the world, symbolized absolute success. Jason had built a reputation as a business genius, a guy who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. People admired him, respected him, and sometimes even feared the name he carried. It was the perfect image, carefully crafted and seemingly unshakable. When I arrived at his headquarters that afternoon, I could feel the weight of that atmosphere in the air. The building was imposing, with mirrored glass reflecting the cloudy sky, and employees bustling past, all dressed like they were on an important mission. The doorman recognized me. A slight nod was enough to let me through without questions. I knew that place like the back of my hand, but now I saw everything through different eyes. I walked through the enormous lobby where a group of executives chatted quietly, clearly discussing strategies I had no idea about. In the elevator, I felt the silent tension that hung in that environment, a combination of ambition and veiled fear. Everyone knew Jason was the boss, and that nobody moved without his approval. Arriving at his floor, I knocked on his office door. He opened it with that knowing grin, the kind that says he's got the upper hand. Nothing in his face betrayed weakness, just pure confidence and maybe a hint of disdain. I asked to talk, and he let me in, but not without a condescending tone that made me swallow a lump in my throat. During the meeting, something caught my eye. Jason was deep in negotiations with a group of investors who were clearly unhappy. One of them kept raising objections, and Jason would shoot back with firmness, almost intimidating them. It was like he was tightening the screws to make sure no allies slipped through his fingers. As he spoke, I realized this wasn't just another business meeting. It was a calculated maneuver to consolidate his power, a strategy to weed out any threats. Within the company itself, Jason wasn't just maintaining his empire. He was building an impregnable fortress. The tension in the air became even more palpable when, at the end of the meeting, one of the investors stormed out, visibly peeved. Jason, for his part, maintained that cold, controlled smile, but I knew there was something dangerous lurking behind that facade. Leaving the office, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The man I knew as my adoptive brother wasn't just focused on success, he was willing to crush anyone who dared to challenge him. And the company, that symbol of his strength, was the battleground where he played without mercy. I wondered what would happen if I became one of those obstacles. If, all of a sudden, I decided I wouldn't just sit on the sidelines of that story anymore. Little did I know that by taking on the challenge, I wouldn't just change my destiny, but his too, in ways he could never have imagined. After that day, at Jason's company, I couldn't get what I'd seen and felt out of my head. I went home with a mix of anger, frustration, and a weight that seemed to grow heavier by the minute. Everything seemed to be conspiring against me. The story my family told about me, the limitations I'd put on myself, and of course, the huge shadow cast by my brother. It was that night, at a cozy little coffee shop, that I met up with my friend, Emma. She knew all about my past, my heartaches, my small victories, and she always had an impressive knack for seeing beyond the obvious. Sitting there with a warm cup of tea in my hands, I spilled my guts about everything that was eating at me. I feel so small next to him, Emma. He has everything, the respect, the power, the money, and me, I can barely get noticed. Every time I try to take a step forward, he's there to remind me I don't belong in that world. My voice wavered, and tears threatened to fall, but I held them back. Emma looked me in the eyes, with that mix of warmth and firmness only she possessed. Harper, you're not small, and you don't need to live in anyone's shadow. What you need to do is change the game. It's not enough to just want to be noticed. You have to be unforgettable. You have to make him regret ever underestimating you. Those words resonated like a call to something bigger within me. I couldn't stay passive anymore. I couldn't accept that my life would be defined by someone who never believed in me. The idea of revenge, which once seemed distant, began to take shape, silent but powerful. In that moment, it wasn't just about money or power. It was about respect, about reclaiming my dignity, and showing that I wasn't just an obstacle to anyone. I could be a force. And for that, I'd need to be strategic, patient, and smart. It wasn't enough to simply react. I needed to plan. I started to mentally sketch out a plan. Something unexpected. Something that would hit his weak spot. I knew he hated losing control, being challenged. That's where I needed to step in. Destabilize his empire without him realizing it until it was too late. At the same time, I felt a deep fear. It wasn't a paralyzing fear, but the kind that warns you of real risks. I'd have to be careful because playing this game against someone like Jason could cost me dearly, but what held me back wasn't fear. It was determination. I no longer wanted to be that humiliated adopted sister. I wanted to be someone who makes history, who commands respect, and if necessary, who collects interest on all the disdain I'd ever received before saying goodbye. To Emma, I took a deep breath and told myself, this is just the beginning. I'm going to take him down, his way, my way. And he's going to understand that underestimating someone like me was the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning arrived with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I knew I couldn't just wait for things to change on their own. I needed to act and fast. I decided the first step would be to truly understand what lay beneath the impeccable facade of Jason's company. If he was so untouchable, then there had to be something he was hiding, and I was going to find it. I started with some basic research, but it didn't take long to realize that public information wouldn't give me even half of what I needed. That's when I turned to old contacts, people who, for whatever reason, had fallen out of his circle, or who might be dissatisfied but were afraid to speak up. I managed to talk to a few former employees who had left in recent months. The stories I heard began to paint a completely different picture from the glittering success Jason flaunted. Financial problems were hidden behind inflated reports, and undisclosed debts were starting to surface. More than that, there was a climate of fear and mistrust in the office, a toxic environment that made many want to bolt. A confidential source told me about a recent contract Jason almost lost because his sales team was fractured and rumors of corruption started swirling. What really struck me was how tightly he was controlling these loose ends. But no one was happy. I sensed that his empire was cracking at the seams. As more information surfaced, I jotted down every weakness, every slip-up, every dissatisfaction. That could give me an edge. I started to piece together a puzzle that, until then, only I seemed to see. Jason might be ruthless, but he wasn't invincible. What scared me a little was the sheer magnitude of what I was uncovering. It wasn't just a simple, administrative oversight. It was a complex web of problems that, if used correctly, could turn the tables in my favor. And I had to be careful because any misstep could put me directly in his crosshairs. But the feeling of finally having a weapon in my hand was liberating. That sense of powerlessness that had shadowed me for so long began to dissipate, replaced by something more tangible. Control. I no longer had to be just the humiliated adopted sister. I could be the piece that changed the rules of the game. However, as I walked those streets, my mind buzzing with ideas, I couldn't help but wonder what Jason would do if he realized someone was messing with his weaknesses. He wasn't the type to back down easily, and I knew the battle I was starting wouldn't be a cakewalk. But as tough as it was going to be, I was ready. The die was cast. I wouldn't accept being underestimated anymore, nor would I let anyone control my life. And with each new discovery, the certainty grew. I was much closer to turning the tables than ever before. What I didn't know yet was the price I'd have to pay for it, and if I was truly prepared for that. Dinner that night felt like a carefully laid trap. The house was packed. My parents, some distant relatives, Jason's friends I barely knew, and the atmosphere had that heavy formality, typical of gatherings where secrets and tensions hide behind forced smiles. I knew Jason lived for these moments. He used family as his stage, and I, unwittingly, ended up center stage. As soon as I arrived, the stares started to weigh on me. It wasn't just the discomfort of being surrounded by people who'd been judging me for years. It was the certainty that Jason was waiting for the perfect moment to knock me down. And he didn't waste any time. Mid-conversation, out of the blue, he dropped that line like a verdict. "You'll never amount to anything, Harper. It's always been that way, and it always will be. You might as well get used to it." His voice was calm but cutting, sharper than any shout could have been. A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone looked at me, some with pity, others with that knowing smirk that says, "I told you so." My face burned, and I just wanted the ground to swallow me whole. The humiliation wasn't just from his words, but from the way everyone expected me to just accept it as gospel truth. But instead of crying or retorting right away, I bottled it all up. The shame, the pain, the rage. It was a massive weight, but also a spark that ignited something new within me. Because in that instant, I realized this wouldn't be my story forever. While Jason kept talking, oblivious to anyone else's reaction, I began to mentally map out what I needed to do to flip the script. That moment, which could have crushed me, only made me stronger. It was as if every word he uttered poured fuel on a fire I didn't even know I still had. After dinner, alone in my room, I replayed that scene over and over. The shame still stung, but not in the way I expected anymore. Instead of feeling diminished, I felt a growing, almost palpable determination. I knew I couldn't depend on his approval, or anyone in my family's, ever again. It was time to show everyone, especially Jason, that I was more than his words, that I could achieve far more than he ever imagined. And not just achieve, but do it my way, with intelligence and strategy. What he didn't know was that this public humiliation would be the trigger for a silent battle, one I was already starting to prepare behind the scenes. A battle that would shake everything he'd built to its core, and the cruelest part of it all, he wouldn't have a clue what was coming. Not until it was too late. I could hardly believe it when I got the message. That contact, who I'd always considered part of Jason's inner circle, had decided to reach out. And not out of kindness. That much was clear. He was also fed up, worn down by my adopted brother's authoritarian and manipulative ways. This was the break I needed, perhaps the only one that would come my way. I'd met Nathan at a social event a while back, one of the executives at Jason's company. Always discreet, but clearly someone carrying an invisible burden. After the awkward dinner, for some reason, he felt comfortable enough to seek me out. At first I was wary, questioning his intentions, but his sincerity seemed genuine. Nathan told me what few knew. The dissatisfaction within the company was greater than I'd imagined. Many were tired of the toxic atmosphere, the unilateral decisions, the constant fear of losing their job on Jason's whim. He told me about secret meetings, thwarted plans, and an internal struggle that was undermining the very foundations of my brother's empire. More than that, Nathan offered me something invaluable: exclusive information, documents, and contacts that could be crucial for me to find Jason's ultimate Achilles heel. It was an unlikely alliance, but an essential one. I needed this to move forward, for my revenge plan to have a solid, real foundation. As we talked, a mix of adrenaline and caution washed over me. Nathan's help meant not just an advantage, but also enormous risks. If Jason found out someone on his own team was leaking information, he wouldn't hesitate to retaliate with full force. I needed to be meticulous, cover my tracks, play a game of shadows. However, that collaboration gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Finally, I wasn't alone in this unequal fight. I had someone on my side who understood what was at stake and who, like me, wanted to bring down Jason's absolute dominance. That night, as I went through the documents Nathan sent me, I could clearly see where the weaknesses lay. Hidden debts, poorly drawn contracts, dissatisfied employees ready to rebel. All of it was a minefield that could collapse at any moment. It was time to act with intelligence and precision. Information was power, and I was ready to use every bit of it to turn the tide. No longer would I be at the mercy of my brother's humiliations and false superiority. Now I had allies, strategies, and renewed determination. Before hanging up, Nathan gave me a direct warning. Be careful, Harper. Jason's dangerous, and he won't take losing lying down. That only confirmed what I already knew. The battle was far from over, and the price of victory could be steep, but I was ready for it. Everything seemed to be falling into place. The information, the alliance, the growing sense of control. But life, of course, doesn't hand out victories without first testing what we're willing to endure. And that's exactly what happened that week when the blow landed where I least expected it, right in what I thought was my emotional sanctuary. I got the news over the phone, one of those calls that makes the world stop for a moment. My father, who'd always had a complicated relationship with both me and Jason, called to say he was disappointed with the decisions I was making, that I was losing my way, becoming bitter and distant, that if I kept going down this path, I'd end up alone. They were harsh words, not just cutting, but leaving an open wound in my chest. Up until that point, even though my family dynamic was always fraught with tension, I still thought my dad was my safe harbor, someone who could understand my pain and back my choices. To see him side with Jason, to realize he'd chosen to believe the adopted brother who'd always put me down, it plunged me into a darkness I wasn't sure I'd ever escape. The humiliation, the feeling of abandonment, the sheer loneliness. It all came crashing down in a whirlwind that almost made me throw in the towel. I thought about giving up, just letting go of that seemingly impossible fight. The voice in my head screamed that I wasn't good enough, that I'd never get past this. But deep in that emotional pit, something started to form. A tiny glimmer, a spark of strength that, until then, had been hidden under a thick layer of pain. I realized this wasn't the end of the road. It was actually the turning point. Being alone, being disbelieved, humiliated. All of it just showed that I was fighting against something real, a barrier worth breaking down. The feeling of powerlessness was replaced by an even greater desire to prove to everyone, and to myself, that I was capable of pushing through. That night, staring at my bedroom ceiling, the tears that had been streaming down my face turned into pure determination. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity. It was about turning pain into power. I knew Jason wouldn't give up easily. I knew the battle would demand more than I could imagine. But now at least, I had clarity about what I was fighting for. And that gave me immense strength. The road ahead was uncertain and tough, but I was ready to walk it. No matter how low I'd fallen, I would get back up. And when I did, no one would ever know what truly fueled me. Because sometimes hitting rock bottom is where the real fight begins. The moment I'd been quietly preparing for finally arrived. It was time to act, to channel all that frustration, pain, and humiliation into something concrete, buying out Jason's company. But don't kid yourself, it wasn't going to be a walk in the park. Behind that facade of power, there was a cold, calculated, and nuanced battle that only those behind the scenes could truly grasp. The negotiations started discreetly, far from the watchful eyes of my brother and his team. With the intel Nathan fed me, I knew exactly where to press. Every hidden debt, every botched contract, every disgruntled employee was a piece of my puzzle. My strategy wasn't just financial, it was psychological. I wanted to shake Jason's confidence, make him realize that the ground he was standing on wasn't solid anymore. In every meeting, I maintained a composure that felt impossible to feel on the inside. The knot in my stomach was real, but I couldn't let it show. I used my voice as a weapon, firm, controlled, confident. Across the table, I could see his representatives trying to hide their surprise, their irritation, and, in some moments, their fear. The hardest part was dealing with Jason's arrogance. Even from a distance, he had eyes and ears everywhere. I knew he'd try to undermine my efforts, discredit my intentions, and, if possible, crush my play before it gained any traction. That's why I had to be even more strategic. At times, I intentionally pulled back, as if taking a step backward to actually set up a bigger push forward. I used allies within his company who were on my side to sow doubt and insecurity, making his team question if it was worth keeping control of that business in the hands of an adopted brother who seemed increasingly unstable. Every call, every email, every meeting was a test of endurance. My heart pounded, and I knew one wrong move could mean the end of my chance. But there was no turning back now. And then, in the middle of that silent war, came the first big win. One of his main financial Partners decided to reconsider their support, an unexpected blow that deeply rattled Jason's confidence. I felt, in that instant, that the tide was turning. That seemingly invincible empire was starting to show cracks. And I was on the right side of the fight when I hung up the phone after that last negotiation. For a brief moment, I allowed myself a sigh of relief. But not for long. I knew Jason wouldn't take this threat lying down. The real battle was still ahead. I was ready. Jason quickly caught on that something was amiss. It didn't take long for the first signs that my move was shaking his stronghold. To reach him, and believe me, he reacted with all the ferocity that always characterized his way of being. But for the first time, it wasn't just empty words. He was, in fact, on the back foot. His reaction came like a hurricane, threatening calls to my contacts, attempts to trash my reputation, and even a formal request to halt negotiations. He wanted to make me back down, to show me I was nothing more than an amateur player trying to mess with a giant. But he didn't know me that well. I'd been expecting this storm. I'd seen that stance many times before. It was the only way he knew how to maintain control. Attack, intimidate, make the opponent squirm. Only this time, I wasn't shaken. On the contrary, my determination grew. In all the meetings that followed, I kept my cool. I never let my tone waver, never gave him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. Across the table, I could sense his frustration growing, the restless glint in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. Jason was, for the first time, facing someone who wouldn't back down. Over the next few days, I started to see a change in his behavior. Jason was forcing allies to choose sides, pressuring employees to remain loyal, using every resource to try and stop my advance. But it was too late. The network I had started to build was solid. Deep down, I knew that true power wasn't in contracts or cold numbers, but in mental and emotional strength. And that, Jason never had against me. He always thought I was weak, easy to manipulate. Today, I was the complete opposite of that. There was a dangerous calm within me, a certainty that came from pain and overcoming it. I was in control, and he was starting to realize he couldn't treat me like the fragile, underestimated sister anymore. Even with the pressure and veiled threats, I stood my ground. I moved forward steadily, step by step, knowing that every move I made was a piece on the board that would lead to victory. And in that moment, more than ever, I understood that winning wasn't just about money or power, but about never letting anyone tell you who you are or what you can achieve. Jason tried to knock me down, but he only made my resolve stronger, and the battle wasn't even over yet. The day I'd been waiting for finally arrived. The moment when all the strategy, all the silent struggle, all those sleepless nights spent planning every single step would culminate in the acquisition of Jason's company. The weight of that decision hung heavy in the air, not just for me, but for everyone who had a stake in this whole saga. When I walked into the conference room for the final round of negotiations, I could feel his gaze piercing the room. Jason was there, still as a statue, his expression grim but revealing a hard-to-pinpoint mix. Defeat, anger, maybe even a touch of respect. I knew he was worn out, not just physically, but emotionally. The conversation started cold with his representative, trying to squeeze out concessions. But this time, I wouldn't budge. Every word, every decision came from a place of hard-won strength. This wasn't the Harper who used to ask for favors, who would swallow her pride. I was the Harper who called the shots in her own life. When the final signature hit the paper, a heavy silence fell over the room. Jason stared at me, and in that exchange of glances, I noticed something I hadn't expected, a fragility I'd never seen in him before. Behind that impenetrable facade was a broken man, defeated not just by the power play, but by everything our shared history carried. And right then, in that moment, something shifted inside me. The rage that had fueled me gave way to a more complex emotion, a mix of empathy, sadness, and even a bit of relief. I knew the victory wasn't just about him, but about all the past that had driven us apart. Jason, in a low voice, told me he never expected me to make it this far, that he'd underestimated what I was capable of. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence speak for itself. Sometimes, silence is the best answer. I walked out of that room with the feeling that this chapter was truly closed, But I also knew that despite the win, the road to my inner peace was still a long one. I had the power in my hands, no doubt. But the real challenge now was figuring out what to do with it. And that's where the story truly began. When Jason finally dropped to his knees, begging for mercy, I didn't feel a momentary satisfaction or an empty joy. It was a heavy, loaded moment, not just for him, but for me too. Because there, in his vulnerable position, was the real proof that I had achieved something far greater than just a company, the respect he'd never given me, and, most importantly, control over my own life. He pleaded, his words a raspy whisper, trying to undo years of contempt and humiliation. But that's not what I wanted. Not just some random revenge, a quick, fleeting punishment. I wanted him to understand what really mattered. That power isn't meant to be used to stomp on others, but to build, to respect, and to acknowledge the dignity of every person. I laid out my conditions, clear and firm. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because it was essential that he recognized my strength and how much I had changed. That he saw that the Harper of yesterday, the one he always looked down on, no longer existed. I was the mistress of my own life, my own story, and my own destiny. Jason listened in silence to every word. His expression was a mix of shame and acceptance. And even after everything, I felt a kind of compassion. Not for the person he was, but for the possibility that he could learn, grow, and perhaps, one day, redeem himself. In that moment, I realized my victory had a much deeper meaning than I'd ever imagined. It was about dignity, about recognizing your own worth, and never again letting anyone diminish you. I close this chapter of my life with the awareness that true strength lies in getting back up after a fall, in transforming pain into lessons, and humiliation into power. And that's the message I want to leave with you, who are listening to me now. Never settle for less than you deserve. Your life is in your hands, and the power to change its courses too. That is the real victory. If you've ever been in situations where you felt undervalued, share your story in the comments below. I'd really love to hear how you dealt with it. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that show we can always bounce back.